Okay, is that all right? All right, great. Well, good afternoon, folks, and welcome to another one of our weekly TESS seminars. TESS, of course, is our Center for Tropical, Environmental, and Sustainability Science, which is one of our main forums for terrestrial research here at JCU. This is nominally the last talk of the semester, although I've just learned we're actually going to have a special seminar next week with some very special guests that we've got coming right now. We won't get into all that right now. Our speaker this week is Chris Dickman. Chris, for anybody who's an ecologist, wildlife type person, a mammologist, an arid zone person is going to know about Chris Dickman's work, seminal work on mammalian communities and ecosystems in arid regions of the world, especially in Australia. Chris got his training at the University of Leeds in the UK. He then did his PhD at ANU. Subsequent to that, he had a postdoctoral fellowship at University of Oxford. And he then spent a few years at the University of Western Australia before moving, of course, to the very prestigious University of Sydney, nominally Australia's top university, or certainly one, two, or three, where he's been for a long time. Chris is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science. He's a tremendously productive and interactive scientist, and it's a real pleasure to have Chris joining us here today. Chris Dickman, thank you.
Many thanks indeed, Bill. Let's check, is that volume okay for people at the back? Okay, all good, thank you. So one of the things that struck me coming into Cairns today was the lushness of the forests all around the city itself and around the campus. I work in another part of Queensland where the forests are not quite so lush. In fact, they're often seen to be quite simple environments. They're open, arid environments. But what I'll be doing today, one of the aims I'll have is to show you that these environments are not quite so simple after all. And in fact, that they're repositories of biodiversity and really fascinating processes that shape the patterns of the biodiversity that we see. But before we go further, I'd like to make an acknowledgement of country. To acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia, to recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I currently work and live on Gadigal country in Sydney and work on Wonkamutla country in Western Queensland. I've also travelled and worked on country of many others and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So what I'd like to try to cover today is a range of topics. I'll focus primarily on small vertebrates, and particularly within the small vertebrates on small mammals, and look at the patterns of dynamics over space and time that these vertebrates show. And I'll particularly look at the processes that we think are the key drivers of these patterns. These will be rainfall, fire, and introduced predators. I'll ask in passing whether Australian deserts are different from those in other parts of the world, and come back to this question about whether they're simple environments or not. And then finally look at briefly at the effects potentially of climate change and what we might do from a management perspective. Well, a few years ago we drew up what we thought might be some of the processes, patterns that we can observe in arid Australia. It's clearly not as simple as we might have thought, and I'll be suggesting throughout the rest of the talk that there are in fact a complexity of different processes that operate to structure the patterns of biodiversity that we see. So just putting this up, not because I'm going to be going through it in detail, although we will be looking at some of the key processes that underpin this complexity. What do we mean by arid Australia? Around 70% of the continent, depending on which definition you use, can be considered arid. One of the dominant biomes of the arid zone is the spinifex grassland biome, shown in green here. It covers something like 40% of the continent, so it's one of the, if not the biggest, biomes that the country has. It's a very important, very dominant, very widespread. The red star indicates the area that I'll be talking most about. We've got some evidence that the patterns that we found in the Simpson Desert actually can be translated into or transferred to other sand-ridge deserts, such as the Great Sandy or the Great Victoria, but I'll be focusing primarily on work in the Simpson Desert. It's a boom-bust environment, or sometimes called a pulse reserve, and essentially it looks something like this. Long periods of productivity here, long periods of low productivity, not much happens. You get a big rainfall event that generates a resource pulse that results in a boom in consumer populations. This may last for just a few months. If you get follow-up rains, it can last a little longer, but inevitably there will be a decline phase that'll be fairly rapid, and you return to a low productivity situation again. The booms, when they happen, are pretty spectacular. You can get raging torrents off some of the range country. The clay pans fill up, you get carpets of wildflowers, waterfowl that you'd never expect to see in arid Australia turn up in their hundreds, or in the case of things like flock pigeons, flock bronzewings, hundreds of thousands. So the magical times. Do these boom and bust periods characterise the Australian arid zone? There's been a lot of work on this, and the consensus seems to be that they are reasonably unique to arid Australia, particularly northern arid regions. This is one of the examples. This is a depiction of the rainfall event size and the number of times those events have occurred over a period of 100 years. The comparison is between three sites: Windora in Australia, Richmond in South Africa, and Helena in Montana in the US. Each of these sites is of a similar latitude, similar rainfall, around 300 mils a year. And what you can see, if you scan from left to right, as the event sizes get bigger, up to around 200 mils in a single event, single rainfall event, these occur only in Australia. So the arid Australian situation is that there are many more much larger rainfall events than occur in comparable arid parts of the world. The only places that come close, parts of the Thar Desert, the Somali Desert, and parts of the Kalahari-Namib Desert in southern Africa. Well, what do booms and busts look like on the ground? Something like this. The two figures on the left represent a couple of images taken during bust conditions near the start of the study. And the photos on the right illustrate the same place during a boom period 22 years later. And you can see there's a very big difference in the amount of vegetative productivity. The picture in the middle shows what can happen if you get caught out unexpectedly during a boom event. That was the one and only time my wife and daughter both came out on a trip to the Simpson Desert, and for some strange reason they haven't returned. It may have something to do with the waterlogged car and the 30-kilometre walk we had back to our main camp through mud. But Simpson Desert study region itself, we work in the northeastern Simpson Desert. It's a spinifex-dominated dune field. You can see the serried ranks of the sand dunes in the top figure. They're linear, long, very regular features that can run for hundreds of kilometres. Spinifex in the bottom figure. It's a fairly extreme environment, in addition to being a boom and bust environment. Temperatures fluctuate from -7 to over 50 degrees. It's prone to fires, particularly after big rainfall events. And this is essentially where we've been working and collating information on mammals and lizards and frogs and a whole variety of other things as well for quite a number of years. The sites are shown here. The 12 sites that we've operated over cover around 8,000 square kilometres. At each site, there are between 2 to 5 sampling plots. And at these, we've focused on looking at the small vertebrates, also invertebrates. We've got a weather station at each site, run many experiments over the years, and try to get out there as often as we can. The study species that I'll be talking a little bit more about include some of these animals. The gecko in the top, I'll say a little bit about lizards, but focus primarily on mammals just for the purposes of time. But two of the key species that I'll be talking probably a lot about are the hopping mouse here and the sandy inland mouse, two of the most abundant native rodents. And then the three other species here, they're all desiurid marsupials. The mulgara, which is a carnivorous marsupial, it eats other small mammals and a wide range of invertebrates. And then dunarts and ningauis, which are primarily insectivorous. So these are some of the major players. We catch them in pitfall traps, such as this, drift fence going across the top to intercept the animals and guide them into the traps. So I'd like to look first of all at the effects of rainfall. This is a boom and bust environment. This is a trace over about 25 years of rainfall events and the capture rate of the two native rodent species. So here we've got standardized capture rate, captures per 100 trap nights over time for the sandy inland mouse in the top and the spinifex hopping mouse in the bottom figure. And what you can probably see straight away is that after a very big rainfall event, a drought-breaking, greater than 90th quantile rainfall event, you get an eruption in the numbers of these animals. It's not an immediate eruption. It's usually about 6 months before you see a big increase in the numbers. And it's simply the time required for the rainfall to generate the primary productivity, the burst of seeds that can then be utilized by the rodents to turn all that productivity into successful reproduction. A similar pattern that's seen for one of the desiurid marsupials, just one of them, and that's the top one, the mulgara. The mulgara is, as I mentioned, more carnivorous than the other desiurids, and it feasts on the rodents when they erupt. So the delay for the mulgara tends to be a little bit longer than that for the rodents. Mulgara populations tend to boom about 10 months to a year after the rodents have begun to hit their peak. And that simply reflects the time for the mulgara itself to turn all its rodent prey into offspring. In the bottom figure, you can see that there's a very different pattern. If you correlate the capture rate of the dunart with the rainfall, it's actually negative. Around 2 to 6 months after rainfall, dunart populations tend to drop. So it's a completely different situation from that seen in the native rodents and in the mulgara. We think it's because the dunarts don't build their own burrows. They're critically dependent on rodent burrows or spider or scorpion burrows for shelter. They can't dig their own burrows, and so when it rains, they're uniquely susceptible to being drowned out. They can't stop at their burrows as the rodents or the mulgara can. I won't say too much more about the processes that drive these ups and downs, but essentially after heavy rainfall, rodents show an increase in the fidelity to the burrows. The numbers of animals living in the burrows increases. They tend to stay put for longer periods. Reproduction is more successful, survival goes up, and hence population numbers increase. With the desiurids, mulgara populations are essentially similar in their response. They become more sedentary after rainfall. They stay put for longer. Reproduction and survival are both elevated. Whereas for the smaller desiurid species, dunarts, the ningauis and so on, populations decline. But there is one strange thing that happens consistently, and that is, shown in red here, that the richness of small desiurids increases. The number of these species actually increases post-rain, even though their populations decline. And this is something that spurred a lot of thinking and a lot of experimental work to try to figure out what was going on. So small desiurid species richness increases after rain. After looking at a whole range of possible explanations, one that seemed to fit the observations we were making was that it was the presence of the mulgara. If you have the mulgara in the system, then you tend to have more of the smaller desiurid species in the system too. And if you compare the mean species numbers across a range of sites, With the mulgara, it's around nearly 5.5 other species of small dasyurid. Without the mulgara, it's just around 3. So after thinking about this, we raised the hypothesis that somehow the mulgara facilitates increases in the local richness of the smaller dasyurid species. In other words, it's having a keystone effect, possibly as a keystone predator, but there might be other explanations too. Well, to try to figure out what was going on, we designed a simple experiment to exclude the mulgara from particular plots in the Simpson Desert. This included building large fenced exclosures to keep mulgaras out. You might be able to see in the Google Earth image on the bottom right what looks like a square carved out of the vegetation. We had to dig these things in, clear vegetation either side of the fence that we put in, and it wore out a number of field crews over a period of a year. But we managed to get three removal plots, 3 fence control plots that were just wire that didn't exclude anything, including mulgaras, and 3 open control plots. And we sampled over 20 months to see what the effects would be. So here's a close-up of a finished fence. We tried to make sure that these fences were permeable to all species except the mulgara, and that meant for one of the species, Spinifex hopping mouse, we had to put these little gates in because the wire mesh wasn't of the appropriate size to allow them through. But they seemed to work. The proof was in the pudding. Here are the results of the numbers of mulgaras before and after the fences were put up. So the green line here represents the exclusion plots where mulgaras were actively removed. We caught them in the exclusion plots and put them outside. When the fences were finished, the numbers of mulgaras pretty much fell to 0 for much of the study. There was one incursion over here, but essentially the exclusion treatment worked. The effects of this on the species richness of the smaller dasyurids was pretty stark. Again, the green line represents the number of small dasyurids in the exclusion plots where mulgaras had been removed. After the fences were completed, the number of small dasyurids in these plots declined to just 1. That one remaining dasyurid species happened to be this small dunart, the lesser hairy-footed dunart, and its numbers increased fairly dramatically above those in both the open control and the fence control treatments. So it seemed that take away the mulgaras and one of the smaller species, here the lesser hairy-footed dunart, increases and suppresses in some way the richness of the other dasyurids. We were intrigued by this and wanted to find out a little bit more. Was it that the mulgaras were eating the dunarts, but not the other species? Were the dunarts in turn eating the smaller dasyurids, or was something else going on? We looked at the diets of the species, and it was pretty clear that the mulgara wasn't really eating very many dunarts at all. They comprised a very small amount of the diet, much less than 5% in pretty much all sampling occasions that we looked at. So we thought perhaps they're generating the effect via fear. So we looked at a couple of experimental ways of trying to understand if dunarts are fearful of mulgaras and avoid them because of cues that the mulgaras leave. We looked at odor cues as being the most obvious. The top figure here represents the giving up density in the presence of mulgara scats and in the presence of control scats made of plasticine for both dunarts and ingaois. Essentially, giving up densities are little sites where you put a measured amount of food. You come back after a night's potential foraging by the target species, and you measure how much food is left. If there's not much food left, the assumption is that the target species has foraged there fairly consistently, and it's eaten most of the food you provided. If the giving up density is high, by contrast, it hasn't spent much time there, and an interpretation may be that it's fearful of doing so. You can see for the giving up density situation in the top figure for the dunart that the giving up density was relatively high. in the presence of Mulgara scats. That is, they didn't really go near the food that was provided if there was Mulgara odour associated with it. They didn't care about control scats made of plasticine. They quite happily visited those sites. For the Ningawi, it didn't really make any difference. They didn't care whether Mulgara odour was present or not. In the bottom figure, we did the same experiment, but here put the Mulgara or the controlled plasticine scats around the entrances to Dunart or Ningawi burrows and looked to see if the animals returned. And it's pretty clear that burrow fidelity in the case of the Dunarts was very low in the presence of Mulgara scats. Put Mulgara scats near them and they don't return to their burrows, they go elsewhere. Ningawis, they didn't care. So it does appear that there is a fear interaction that's going on rather than direct predation that's causing the suppression of Dunart activity by Mulgaras. What about the evidently suppressive effects of Dunarts on the smaller dasyurids like Ningawis? We couldn't get bucket loads of Dunart scats, unfortunately, so we had to devise some other experiments, and these were simply to put the two species into 10 by 10 metre enclosures and measure their activity. In the presence of Dunarts, Ningawis really didn't spend much time active at all. They spent all their time pretty much under spinifex. We measured this by sitting up all night and looking at the amount of time that animals with these little fishing light sticks on their backs were present in the enclosure. The presence of Dunarts, Ningawis spent pretty much all night under the spinifex, hiding. In the absence of Dunarts, when Ningawis were put into these enclosures on their own, they spent around 2.5 orders of magnitude more time being active, running around the enclosure than when Dunarts were present. So again, Dunarts don't seem to eat Ningawis. They comprise a tiny part of the diet of the Dunarts. Fear seems to be driving the interaction that we see. So if we depict it diagrammatically, it looks as if the Mulgara is having a negative effect on the lesser hairy-footed Dunart. Lesser hairy-footed Dunart in its turn has negative effects on the smaller species of dasyurids. And if you put the two negative interactions together, you have an indirectly positive effect of Mulgaras on the smaller dasyurid species. We thought that was a pretty interesting interaction, but it's not where it ends. These interaction webs are much more extensive. We started to look at the effects of Mulgaras on other species. It turns out that wolf spiders decline in the absence of Mulgaras. The lesser hairy-footed Dunart really focuses on wolf spiders. If you give them a selection of different kinds of prey, wolf spiders, pisaurid spiders, meturgid spiders, beetles, they target the wolf spiders. And in the presence of Dunarts, if Dunarts are particularly active, these wolf spiders decline dramatically in abundance. So on the right of the figure, simple count of numbers of spiders per 100-metre transect. In the presence of Mulgaras, there are around 13 wolf spiders per transect, around a third of this if Mulgaras are absent, but Dunarts are present and actively running around seeking them out. It turns out there's a really further intriguing interaction between the Dunarts and the spiders, but I won't go into that just now. And then there are other species that also take part in these cascades. These are the introduced species, the eutherian predators, the cat, the fox, and the dingo. I'll just say something briefly about the diets of the cat, the fox, and the dingo. I'll say a little bit more in a few minutes as we go further forward. But if you look at the selectivity of different prey species, different mammalian prey species, by the cat, the fox, and the dingo, the cat actively selects species such as the sandy inland mouse, such as Mulgaras. The fox does this too. Whereas the dingo will eat them, but it tends to take them much more opportunistically in relation to their abundance. So consumption really is selective for some species by the cat and the fox, but much less so for dingoes. We'll come back to this in just a moment. If we look at the interactions between cats and foxes and dingoes themselves, we've got camera traps that have been set up for quite a long period in the desert. And if you do simple plots of the numbers of photos of foxes versus dingoes in the top figure, cats versus dingoes in the middle figure, and foxes and cats in the bottom figure, some interesting patterns emerge. In the top figure, it seems that red fox populations tend to, or red fox activity rather, declines in at least two situations during the decline phase and the bust phase. Fox activity is suppressed in the presence of dingoes. During boom periods, this is the top line in the top figure. Here, it seems that foxes show a slightly positive relationship with dingoes, but at other times they appear to be much less active. For cats, in the middle figure, there is, I'm sure you can see this, in the middle figure, at all stages of small mammal population booms and busts, cat activity is suppressed in the presence of dingoes. Foxes and cats tend to co-vary with each other, possibly because their response to the dingo is fairly similar. If we put all of this together, we've got a multi-level ecological cascade. It's not necessarily all trophic because some of the interactions are fear-based rather than trophic. But it begins at the top with the dingo that has suppressive effects on the smaller mesopredators, the fox and the cat. That in turn has an indirectly positive effect on the mulgara, which is not selectively depredated by the dingo, in contrast to the fox and cat. And as we've seen, in the presence of the mulgara, the lesser hairy-footed darnot is suppressed, and that in turn releases populations of the smaller dasyurids with flow-on effects again to spiders and geckos and other nocturnal animals. A lot of this cascade is driven by fear. Top part probably by predation between the dingo, fox, cat, and the small mammals, but fear effects lower down. There are other effects of rainfall and fire of livestock that affect the magnitude of these interactions. But essentially what we have is a 6-level ecological cascade that builds and disappears, it dissolves very quickly. So these, for land-based ecosystems, 6-level cascades are extremely unusual. And to have them building and then dissolving within periods of just a few months is really quite extraordinary. The second process I'd like to talk a little bit about is wildfire. So in much of arid Australia, wildfires follow big rainfall events. So these are events going back over the last century or so. Big fires occurred in 1917, 1951, 74, and 2001. In each case, after very big rainfall events. Purple and the pink traces represent rainfall events at 2 stations with long rainfall records just on the edge of the Simpson Desert. In the immediate study area, satellite mapping showed that in 2001, 2002, around 250,000 hectares of the study area burnt. Primarily, this was spinifex grassland. A little bit of woodland burnt, but primarily it was spinifex. In 2011, further fires occurred, again after big rainfall events. They tended not to burn the same areas that had burnt several years previously, but they burnt other areas that had escaped the 2001, 2002 fires. The mean return fire interval for the system is around 26 years, but this is declining. So over the period of study, a lot of the desert has burnt at different times. What are the effects of these fires on the biota? Pretty dramatic, as you can imagine. The bottom figure shows a control burn, and there's a lot of ash and debris that you can see. During a wildfire, the picture on the top right probably gives you a more accurate reflection of what happens. That had been a hillside, a dune side that was covered in spinifex. There were shrubs, acacias, dodoneas, a whole range of different species of shrubs, all disappeared. You're left with bare sand and vegetation doesn't come back until it rains. Often it's very patchy, as in the top middle figure. You get little islands of unburnt vegetation surrounded by huge fire scars. What are the effects of this? Well, if we look at the cover of spinifex, very clearly this declines dramatically. So these are plots showing the coverage of spinifex that were measured before and after the fires occurred in 2001, 2002. The figure in the top represents the sites that were unburnt. There tends to be a bit of a decline in spinifex cover, as it really didn't rain for the 4 years after the fires went through. So the spinifex itself declined a little bit. Yeah. But if you compare that with the figure on the bottom, the burnt sites, spinifex cover dropped to 0, and it didn't really recover. It got to 1 or 2% by 4 or 5 years later. So a dramatic effect on the vegetation, primarily the spinifex. For the small mammals, there was again an effect of the burning. This is again looking at captures per 100 trap nights as an index. In the burnt sites, numbers dropped to 0 after the fire. They were quite high before it, reflecting the boom event generated by the big rainfall event pre-fire. The numbers dropped in the sites that remained unburnt as well, but generally the numbers of animals there were higher than in the sites that were completely burnt. Similar patterns in many of the lizards. Here is a trace for one of the lizard species. Again, fluctuating numbers, but before the fire, but present in both burnt and unburnt sites. After the fire, the sites that were burnt saw a complete reduction in the numbers of this species, and in many other lizard species too, as compared with in the unburnt sites. Anybody knows their Tenotus, I've just realised that it's not a Tenotus dux, it's another Tenotus. But, they show similar patterns. Some of the lizards showed preferential responses to the wildfire. This is one of them. The central netted dragon seems to prefer open areas, and its numbers expanded in the wake of the fire. They were virtually not present at all before the fires occurred, but increased fairly dramatically in abundance afterwards. But it was the exception rather than the rule. If you look at the overall pattern for lizards, we did surveys in 2006 and 2002, immediately after the fires had gone through. And this is a log plot, species richness on the y-axis, log area on the bottom. And as you might expect, these are unburnt fragments. These were the numbers of species that occurred in the unburnt fragments of varying size. Positive relationship, as you'd expect, more species in the bigger patches that remained unburnt. If you compare the two lines, come down from 2002 to 2006, patches that were small tended to lose species at a much greater rate than larger patches in the wake of the fires. So this is a sort of relaxation effect that has been seen in many situations. I think probably in some of Bill's forest fragment studies as well, relaxation effects after fragmentation has occurred. But predation is a very likely phenomenon that's going on here too. And it's one that I want to focus on as the last of the major processes that appear to be structuring some components, at least, of the desert system. So for many years, we've gone out spotlighting at night and counted the numbers of foxes and cats that we see. If you compare the numbers of foxes and cats, as shown in the top trace, with the numbers of a representative small mammal, here the sandy inland mouse, what appears to be happening is that you get an increase in predator activity after a boom event in the small mammals. But that's not surprising. Foxes and cats can move in fairly quickly. They can take advantage of peak populations of small rodents. There are long-haired rats and other things that peak at the same time. And so you tend to get an increase in both foxes and cats after a big rainfall event that has seen an increase in small rodent populations. If you look at the diets of the predators during the different phases of the prey population phases, so this is the 4 phases here: bust, increase, peak, and decrease phases for the small mammals. The diets of foxes and cats are shown in the 2 columns on the right. Numbers of samples were quite large. Essentially, during bust times, small mammals are being eaten by both foxes and cats. They tend to increase their consumption of small mammals during the increase phase. When the small mammals have achieved their peak numbers, they're really they comprise a very large part of the diet of both foxes and cats. But the decrease phase, when the populations are coming down again towards the bust phase, that's when the predators seem to be really honing in on the small mammals. So in the situation where the small mammals are coming down in population size, in the decrease phase with no fire, they're comprising up to 95% of the diet of the fox, up to 92% of the cat. In the wake of both a rainfall event that stimulated a boom and a fire event that's removed all the cover, then small mammals can comprise up to 100% of the diet of both foxes and cats. So they really seem to be honing in on small mammals that are at a particularly vulnerable stage in the population cycle. How do they do this? They really seem to go to areas that are burnt and hang about around the ecotones. This is a plot of the transects with prints of foxes or cats, feral cats in the top figure, red foxes in the bottom, and the different lines represent transects that were carried out, that were inspected at different times after a fire event. The plots here, the transects ran from the unburnt vegetation, the ecotone where the fire burnt to, and way into the area that are burnt. And what you can see is an increase in the activity of both the feral cat and the fox at the ecotone. And they seem to just patrol the ecotone, waiting for small mammals to emerge from the unburnt vegetation into the burnt area where they're easily spotted and captured. So these open environments seem to be particularly problematic. So what we've got is a situation that can be summarized something like this. Again, using the sandy inland mouse as a kind of a reference in the bottom. Capture rate per 100 trap nights. After big summer rains, populations increase. During the decline phase, there is much more intense predation by the red fox and the feral cat on the populations. And this can be exacerbated if you happen to get a fire that follows the rainfall events as well. So there are several interactions that are happening here that make it pretty tough if you happen to be a small mammal. We've tried to model some of these interactions. We put a lot of the processes, the strengths of the interactions into structural equation models. Here's one example. I won't say too much about it because it really is a work in progress. This was a first iteration published around 7 or 8 years ago. But it's an attempt to bring together many of the ingredients, many of the elements that we think are really important in driving these arid systems. If we now, I guess, take stock of where we're at, we've got a complex system here. There are a lot of interactions that are happening. We know that rainfall is important. We know that wildfire is important. We know that feral predators are important. Can we make any predictions about the fate of arid ecosystems further down the track? If we look at rainfall, these are plots of annual rainfall spanning over 100 years or up to over 100 years for a number of different stations around the Simpson Desert, Birdsville, Boulia, Oodnadatta, and I forget the fourth one, but rainfall stations that surround the Simpson Desert. What you can see from these are quantile regressions is that there is an increase in the average rainfall over the last 100 years or so, but there is also an increase in the magnitude of extreme events. So big rainfalls are getting bigger over time. If you factor this in, it's a couple of mils a year. If you factor in the fact that fire frequency is likely to increase as well as a consequence of the increased magnitude and intensity and frequency of these big rainfall events, then you can begin to plug these values into the structural equation models and predict what might happen to different components of the system. So this is some predictions derived from assuming that rainfall will increase by a couple of mils a year over the next century, and that big wildfire events will increase in frequency from once every 26 years now to once every 10 years in 100 years' time, based on current rainfall trends. The prediction is that spinifex cover will decline, but not hugely. It's only a couple of percent, 22% down to 20 or just less. Spinifex seed production may well also decline. It's an index of seed production that we've worked with. The bottom figure represents a prediction about what might happen in the presence of the predators. If you have all predators present, dingoes, foxes, and cats, you get small depression in capture rate. But in the absence of cats and foxes, you get a relatively big increase, around a 9% or more increase. And again, it's, I guess, pulling out the fact that predation seems to be a particularly important factor for small mammals. And although I focus primarily on small mammals, the same pretty much goes for lizards, to a smaller extent for frogs. What's happening here? The process that seems to be particularly important is that when you have these big rainfall events that trigger fires, it makes the country very much more open. As we saw, just sand. There's nowhere to go if you're a small mammal. We did some simple experiments, putting toy mice out in different habitats and seeing how frequently they were attacked by both mesopredators, the fox and the cat. And what you can see is that mice that were put out in the open be attacked much more frequently. The dark bars are cats, light bars are foxes. Toy mice out in the open are attacking much more frequently than those in shrubs, in leaf litter, in spinifex, or on the edge of spinifex. So open habitats are risky. What's the response of small mammals to this? Well, they're not very bright. If you look at a whole range of things that might affect where small mammals are going, they tend to prefer open sand as well. And this means that they're likely to be at particular risk of meeting the predators. And if environments are going to become more open in general in the future, because of declining spinifex cover, because of the increase in the frequency and the magnitude of wildfires, these scenarios aren't so good. Is there anything that we can do? Probably not at scale. It's very difficult to see what we can do at scale. But if there are particular populations, vulnerable species, narrow range endemics perhaps, that are particularly vulnerable to this suite of interactions that we're seeing, then there may be ways that you can alleviate the effects of predation. One that we've been working on is to, rather than try to remove foxes and cats, which is pretty much impossible in very large open environments such as Arid Australia, perhaps you can provide targeted protection for the prey. What we've tried to do is to provide them with protection in the form of these wire mesh tunnels, above ground tunnels. So they're fairly simple. They're big enough, the wire mesh size is big enough to allow all the small mammals, all the lizards, including goannas, to get into the tunnel, but foxes and cats can't. They're provided with a bit of shade cloth at intervals, and that helps if a small mammal, for example, moves into one of these structures and runs along it. Where it runs underneath the shade cloth, it breaks up the search image of the predator and it loses sight of it. Gives the small prey species more of a chance of getting away. So we put a number of these shelters up post-fire in different plots. What are the effects? Behaviorally, it seems that there are some fairly strong effects. Using the giving up density approach again, we, in some pilot trials, put up 3 treatments. We put up the wire mesh fencing. We put up some open fencing, so the wire mesh was there, but it wasn't dug into the ground. Foxes and cats had access, and open sand controls. And put out dishes containing 20 seeds for rodents and 20 mealworms for the dasyurids. We put these out in habitats that are burnt and those that have remained unburnt. What were the effects? Fairly dramatic again. This is the giving up density for the sandy inland mouse in the top figure and for the spinifex hopping mouse in the bottom. On the left-hand part of the figure, in the sites that are burnt, provision of an exclusion cage allowed the animals to forage for much longer, resulting in a low GUD. Here, compared with the cage control and the open control for the spinifex hopping mouse, and here a low GUD for the sandy inland mouse, as compared with the situation in the 2 controls. In the unburnt spinifex, on the other hand, for both species, there was no real difference. There was already adequate cover provided by the spinifex. Provision of an artificial wire mesh had no additional effect. GUDs were the same throughout. So it does seem that provision of shelter at least allows animals to have the behavioural security of thinking they're going to be immune from predation, at least while under the cover that's provided. So just some last thoughts. I won't try to summarise everything that we've covered, but rainfall clearly is important. It increases productivity in these usually quite ephemeral pulses, but they can be dramatic. I focused on the rodents to a large extent, but we were out there a couple of weeks ago and there are flocks of hundreds and hundreds of budgies that are just incredible post-rain. Doesn't have very good effects on small dasyurids, which seem to drown in their burrows. They don't do well at all. Wildfire can follow rain, and when it does, it opens up the environment such that it's a much more risky environment for any small prey animals that are running around. And invasive predators seem to selectively target some of the species that are particularly vulnerable. Native marsupial predators, like the mulgara, on the other hand, can have the opposite effects through generating webs of fear. We've seen that these factors interact, and trying to put this all together into models of climate change, it seems that most of the models indicate that climate change is going to exacerbate the magnitude and frequency of boom-bust events. It's going to exaggerate these suites of interactions and effects that we see. From a management point of view, if arid environments are going to become more risky for small prey, perhaps in targeted situations, which would need to be, I guess, looked at strategically in terms of timing and place, we might be able to provide artificial shelters. Not a solution, of course, for the arid zones in entirety, but if you've got small populations, species that are really at risk, Julia Creek dunarts, some of the large desert skinks, for example, this might be a useful way forward for core populations, even for the more common species. Of course, for a project that's run for 35 years and covered a lot of ground, it's meant a lot of collaborations with many organisations and many people. I'd just like to acknowledge the people and institutions on the slide. The Baduri Hotel is not just a convenient watering hole. They've actually provided us with financial backing as well, and T-shirts that we can provide to volunteers. But it's been a long-term collaboration between lots and lots of people, lots and lots of institutions, and you can see some of the happy people in a shot on the bottom right at the end of one trip. This is our research station. It's Camp Gidgee. We camp under the Gidgee, and pretty much all of our stuff stays out there from trip to trip. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Any questions?
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. Really informative talk. Lots of food for thought there. Questions online or here in the audience?
Yeah, I've got a question, Bill, if you can hear me.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Noel.
Hi, Chris. Thanks very much for that talk. It's really informative and interesting, and makes me yearn for the desert once again. I have a question about the dingoes. You seem to have demonstrated that dingoes do influence a top-down influence, whether it's control or not is a moot point. But in the presence of dingoes, it seems that foxes and cats are less effective in predation. Do you think that ramifies to reduced consumption overall, or is it just they shift their behaviour?
Yeah, thanks, Noel. That's an interesting question. As far as we can tell, it is likely to be a reduction in abundance. It's certainly a reduction in activity. We've got, I guess, the various measures that we have of cat and fox activity are from camera traps that have been running for about 20 years, I guess. Transect plots that we operate on most trips, and spotlight counts. And at least certainly activity is down across all measures in the presence of dingoes. We've always assumed that it reflects a reduction in abundance as well. But one of the things that we haven't found really is fox or cat fur in dingo droppings. If they kill them, they don't seem to eat them. It's not to say that they don't kill them if they find them. Some work from South Australia showed that if you put foxes and cats and dingoes together in large enclosures with GPS collars on, dingoes will kill all the cats they come across, will do so very quickly, and they'll keep coming back to the carcass and peeing on it and looking at it and sniffing it, but they won't eat it. And they do the same with foxes. So the lead researcher in that study, Catherine Moseby, just concluded that dingoes hate cats and foxes. And once they find them, they'll kill them, but they won't necessarily use them as a food source.
How very human.
Yeah, I hope Catherine doesn't mind, but I'm using her words.
Other questions?
Another one online there, Bill, thanks. Yeah, Chris,
Mike.
great talk. Pretty much the only thing you didn't cover was invasive plants. Are there any invasive plants that cause issues out there?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. There are none on the immediate sites, but in the broader region, bufflegrass, excuse me, bufflegrass is a problem, and that it's likely to become an increasing problem in the more riparian areas because it washes in after big rains. So it's not something that really occurs in the sand dunes, but it's something that occurs on the desert's periphery and in some of the inland creeks that run dry in the desert. It's beginning to encroach a little bit there.
So with climate change, you predict greater invasive issues, I presume?
Absolutely. Yeah, invasive acacias, Parkinsonia, certainly bufflegrass, which is there already.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, 1 second. Here first and then John. Yeah, okay.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for that. Took me back to my uni days, and just realised I never did get on one of those excursions out into the Simpson.
Never too late.
No, true. I was just wondering, I know your talk was mainly about the Dasyurids, but with the boom and bust scenario with the reptiles too, did they follow a similar pattern to the small marsupials? Like, did the numbers of reptiles influence? I know feral cats, I'm not sure about the dogs and the foxes and the dingoes, but feral cats eat a lot of the reptiles. So was the numbers of reptiles present, did that influence prey selection on the small?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. The rainfall events didn't have the same dramatic effects on the reptiles generally as they did on the rodents or the mulgara. They did for some of the species. For example, military dragons did well after big rainfall events. But it seemed that for them and for many of the other species of reptiles, it was the timing of the rainfall. So the dragons produce 2 clutches per year, one in the early summer around November, and then a second clutch in February. If the summer rains come early, the first clutch does well. If the rains come late, the second clutch does well. And it's only during a boom year when you've got rainfall run throughout the summer that both clutches do well. Then you've got a little population boom of the dragons. That's the same for many of the skinks, some of the geckos, but not for all of them. Because of their different responses to cover, when the rainfall happens, it generates obviously a pulse of cover. And species like the central netted dragon do very poorly. So it's some parallels with the rodents, but not for all species. But in terms of being hammered after the event by increasing numbers of foxes and cats, what we found is that the foxes and cats tend to go for the small mammals first when they become very scarce. Foxes in particular will move on, they'll eat the reptiles, then the diet will comprise primarily invertebrates, then they'll move on to green plant material, and then they'll disappear. Cats tend to be more focused, they've got a type 2 response, and they'll keep hammering away at the same increasingly scarce prey until we can't find it anymore, but cats often seem to.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderfully comprehensive and penetrating talk. It shows the rewards of sticking with it and burrowing deeper and deeper into the issues. That was very, very, very nice, very satisfying. I just had a thought about how the system might have operated before humans. Your top 2 trophic levels are all introduced mammals, and they weren't there before. There may have been thylacines, but I don't know enough about it to be able to even comment on that. Well, I just was interested in your thoughts about how the balances that you've been describing may have worked before cats and foxes and dingoes.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think the same boom-bust dynamic would still have prevailed. There's some evidence for that if you go back through old explorer records and the recollections of some of the traditional owners as well, that after big rainfall events, before foxes and cats arrived, there were really big eruptions of these species, and then they disappeared. They became very scarce afterwards. So I think what would probably happen is that you'd still have the same overall dynamic, booms and then declines. But I suspect that the decline to the bust phase would be nowhere near as dramatic. So the base level populations, the bust level populations would be greater. The other thing that is really, it's a little bit harder to get a good handle on, and that is the extinction of a wide range of mid-sized mammals. So particularly engineer species. So we know in the Simpson Desert there were once desert bandicoots, there were brush-tailed possums, there were bilbies, there were 2 species of bettong, and many of these species are burrowing species, and they would have had potentially quite dramatic effects on the local environment. And we know from other work that many other species use the burrows that these species create where they've been introduced into predator-proofed enclosures. So that may well have also buffered the effects of resource deficits, of harsh conditions, and provided a greater variety of burrow conditions such that small dasyurids wouldn't necessarily have succumbed so readily to big rainfall events.
A couple of related questions. So I guess then the dingo is sitting in a space that it's been for a while. So it's basically a state for that system that's novel now, but reasonably stable. Like, are you seeing new things pushed in the Simpson?
Not really, but I think one of the warning signs happened with a species I haven't really talked about called the desert mouse. It's another native rodent. It was present pretty much for the first 10 years of the study. At low levels, we catch some every trip. And then in the, after the big rains in 2000 and 2001, they erupted, really big populations. And they were one of the species that were really, really hammered by foxes and cats. And we didn't catch a single desert mouse across the 8,000 square kilometre expanse of our sampling for 15 years after that. So it may well be that if you have a particularly susceptible species like the desert mouse, that isn't necessarily seen as being a candidate for listing as vulnerable at the national level. But over wide regional areas, if big rainfall dumps allow the species to boom and then be picked off by foxes and cats, we may be looking at a susceptible category of species that do boom and bust, that are particularly susceptible to being eaten out by the predators. We got them back after 15 years, but for a long time, we thought we'd had a regional extinction of what otherwise appeared to be a fairly common species. And I think that's a bit of a danger that we haven't really reckoned with. There are, interestingly, some of the early records, if you go back to the 19th century, some of the last records of species like the big-eared hopping mouse, the long-tailed hopping mouse, that are now extinct, they occurred in the wake of very big rainfall events. So it may be that although booms are wonderful, you go out and you see all this productivity and carpets of wildflowers, it's beautiful. There may be particular times of risk if there are feral predators operating in those environments.
Last time before they're gone.
Yes, right.
The spin effects, you showed the model where it was predicted to sort of decrease. So like you've been running for so long, have you seen that trend in your data so far?
Yeah, we have.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's another thing that we hadn't really factored in earlier with the spin effects. It seems to be like many other grasses that after a huge masting event, it needs time to catch its breath. It needs time for the nutrients to be returned to the soil. So you might have a big rainfall event, spin effects, flowers and seeds, and there's a huge masting event desert-wide and everything booms as a consequence. You might have another rainfall event of equal magnitude 2 years later, and the spin effects will send up flowering spikes, but it won't produce seed. And you won't see that big boom event happening 2 years later. There seems to be a refractory period, maybe 7 or 8 years before the spin effects can do its thing again. And that's presumably the time that's required for nutrients to be returned to the soil by the decomposers.
Fabulous level of understanding.
Yeah, really interesting level of this ecosystem. Other questions online or here in the room? Chris, just a quick question. I don't know if it's relevant or not. I've seen, many areas in arid Australia where there's been heavy cattle grazing and a real change in structure and composition of the vegetation. Do spin effect systems, are they subjected to grazing? And if so, livestock grazing, and if so, is that having an impact on them, do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That's actually a really good segue from Mike's last question. And one of the properties that we worked on in the north, Palunga, has been a cattle grazing property for a long time. The cattle don't eat the spinifex leaves, but they do eat the seeds. So it's a system that's really on the edge in terms of nutrients. And it does seem that there are these refractory periods that are required for spinifex to set seed again. If you've got cattle that are being that are introduced in sometimes quite large numbers into these systems, they're eating the spinifex seed with all the nutrients it contains. Then they're being taken out of the system. Over time, you're losing nutrients, critical nutrients that would be otherwise important for the seeding of spinifex in the future. And we've seen on Palunga, the site that's had heavy cattle grazing in the past, that spinifex seeding is much less intense than in the south, where grazing hasn't been an issue. So it does have an effect, but it's not an obvious one. There's no trampling. They don't eat the spinifex leaves as such.
Yeah, that is a little surprising to me. It's not quite what I would have expected. Anyway. Okay, last chance to ask a question. Please let's join me in thanking Chris Dickman for coming all the way up here to Cairns and for giving us one of the most interesting and informative talks we've had in a while. Really appreciate it, Chris. Thank you. That was just perfect.